For the first time in my career, I don't know which launch sequence protects the value and which one destroys it. MFN went from being a policy discussion to being a real, tangible, unavoidable business problem. The kind that keeps market access leaders awake at night.
Pharma is not calling it MFN deals, they're calling it tariff deals, in which they are committing to investment.
If MFN reshapes how the US references international prices, what happens to global launch strategy? What happens to oncology? What happens to rare disease? What happens to access and innovation? To help us unpack that, I am joined by Dr. Prateek Minhas, a global market access strategist who lives and breathes HTA, evidence generation, and payer decision making.
If countries are not able to afford higher price, how long would they not get access to that? There would be a breaking point somewhere.
My second guest is Christopher Vandenberg, a US pricing and policy researcher with deep knowledge of CMS negotiation frameworks, IRA implications, and the operational reality of implementing something like MFN in the US.
The purpose of the MFN and all of these sort of domino effect policies and discussions was to just disrupt. And in that regard, it's worked. It's disrupting. Things are changing.
When I talk to people about MFN, the reactions are all over the place. What is MFN in the US context, and how is it different from this idea people have about single global price?
That US government is paying much more for most drugs or all other countries in the world in general. And I think it's very important for us to remember that the US government is a payer for healthcare for millions of Americans.
As Trish mentioned, around 140 million US people are covered by CMS. Why are those people of healthcare the government is paying more? Is the question related to broader tariffs and investment? Is MFN a tool, a policy tool to get more investment in the US? And that's what we have started to see in some of the deals.
Chris and Prateek, welcome to Drug Diaries. A few weeks ago, I was attending ISPOR conference in Glasgow, and I was having conversation with a senior market access leader from one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And we were standing near the main auditorium between sessions talking about launch planning, HTA pressures, pricing strategy. And then they said something that stopped me completely. They said if MFN lands the way people think, we might have to delay our launch in 2 major markets just to protect the US price. And this wasn't a hypothetical or academic exercise. They were talking about a real oncology asset, one they've spent nearly a decade developing. And suddenly their entire launch plan was at risk, because launching too early in the EU could set a reference price the US might be forced to match, and delaying could slow access for patients who desperately need the therapy. And every scenario they ran created a different problem: commercial, ethical, operational, or political. And then they said something even more striking. For the first time in my career, I don't know which launch sequence protects the value and which one destroys it. And that's the moment MFN went from being a policy discussion to being a real, tangible, unavoidable business problem, the kind that keeps market access leaders awake at night. So today, we are going to unpack that question, the one that leader left hanging in the air. If MFN reshapes how the US references international prices, what happens to global launch strategy? What happens to oncology? What happens to rare disease? What happens to access and innovation? This episode is about understanding MFN, most favored nations policy, not as a political idea, not as a theoretical policy, but as a practical force that could redefine pricing corridors on sequencing, HT evidence requirements, economics of drug development globally. And to help us unpack that, I am joined by 2 exceptional experts from Syneos Health Consulting. Dr. Prateek Minhas, a global market access strategist who lives and breathes HTA, evidence generation, and payer decision making. He has a rare ability to zoom out to system level implications while still giving incredibly practical and real world guidance. My second guest is Christopher Vandenberg, a US pricing and policy researcher with deep knowledge of CMS negotiation frameworks, IRA implications, and the operational reality of implementing something like MFN in the US. So if you want to understand what MFN really means for the US market and the global pricing corridors, he's the person you want to hear from. So that's where we'll begin, with the real-world challenges, the uncomfortable questions, the strategic decisions companies will soon be forced to make. So let's get into MFN and what it could mean for the future of every launch team listening today. Chris and Prateek, welcome to Drug Diaries.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
For joining
Kaushik.
the show. So, of course, it's a topic that I've been wanting to discuss for a very long time. So, I really want to thank you both for joining. And, when I talk to people about MFN, the reactions are all over the place. Some think it's a global price harmonization, other thinks it's US only rebate rule, and some confuse it with the tariff avoidance deals we have seen in the last few years. So, let's start by grounding everyone. Chris, in the simplest terms, what is MFN in the US context and how is it different from this idea people have about single global price?
So, in simplistic terms, I think the overall concept is straightforward in that theoretically, what we hear from government is that it is unfair that the U.S., and by that, I think we really need to be specific, the U.S. government is paying much more for most drugs than most or all other countries in the world in general. And I think it's very important for us to, for me anyway, to remember that the US government is a payer for healthcare for millions of Americans. Those millions of Americans, however, are specifically Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. And if you do some rough math, you'll know that there are about 70 million Medicare beneficiaries and about 77 million Medicaid beneficiaries for which they are purchasing healthcare services and drugs. So from that perspective, I can understand if I am a purchaser of healthcare for a population that I wouldn't want to spend much more than other people or other companies or countries for the same drugs. So from that perspective, the US government is trying to leverage its international power, if you will, to, in one perspective, make the price disparity between what they spend and what other countries spend more even.
Right. And if you were to take a step back and you were to explain the concept of most favored nations pricing to a 12-year-old, how would you explain? Who has no scientific or technical background, who doesn't understand life sciences industry? Is there a simpler analogy that you can use for helping our audience understand this complex thing?
Sure. Well, my daughter says I'm about 5 years old in maturity, so I can probably do this.
Okay.
Right now, the US government, let's say, spends $100 on a bottle of medication for somebody, and they pay that to the drug manufacturer. However, let's say another country, call it Japan, they might spend $40 for that same bottle of medication for people in its country. And we can get into all the reasons why, but we won't, because right now it's just that's the fact. The US is paying this much, Japan is paying this much. And and there's many other countries that are paying, let's say the Japan price, maybe not quite as low as Japan, but around a much lower, 60% less, let's say, or more. And the US government is saying, no, we think we should only pay the same amount as that lowest developed country. So it's also important to point out that we're only talking about a group of countries that are, quote, developed. We're not talking about other countries in which they're getting the price for their medication is much, much lower. We're not talking about those. We're talking about Japan, France, UK, Germany. Who am I missing? I mean, there's several, so I'm not going to list them all right now.
Japan,
Yeah. And so the government, US government is saying, look, we want to pay the amount that the lowest amount is for those developed countries, that block of countries. Okay. Well, what they're also saying, though, in the MFN is that we don't actually expect our prices to go all the way down to what is currently that lowest price. Because what they think they're going to do is cause the Japan price, I'm just picking on Japan for a second here, to go up. Either because the US government has sort of pressured that, or because the manufacturers are coming in and saying, well, I got to raise my price. So a big question that I have, and Prateek's going to answer later, is so manufacturers theoretically could have been trying to raise their price internationally all along. I'm sure they have tried to, right? I mean, it makes sense. And they just couldn't. I'm guessing because the government and the other countries just say, oh, okay, we're just not going to buy your drug then. We're not going to cover it. Our population just won't have access to your drug. At which point the manufacturer says, okay, we'll make a deal. So why is it different now that the manufacturers can raise those international prices and not get blocked? I'm not sure I explained that for a 12-year-old, but man, I sure tried.
No, absolutely. I think that was amazing. And Prateek, your take on that?
When I used to be 12-year-old, I used to love burgers. And I used to ask a lot of questions from my parents. Why this, why that? If they were, suppose I'm having a burger and I like a specific brand, and there are two shops which are selling it. One is more expensive, and the second one is a little bit cheaper. I would ask my parents, are we buying the higher price burger when the burger is the same? It's the same. Think about shops as different countries. If the drug is the same, why is one country paying more than the other country? And that's the fundamental question. But what I think is, what's the ultimate objective of MFN policy? As Chris mentioned, around 140 million US people are covered by CMS. 140, 145. Did I get that number wrong, Chris?
No, it's fine. Every day it changes. But yes, it's fine.
Why are those people of healthcare the government is paying more? Is the question related to broader tariffs and investments? Is MFN a tool, a policy tool to get more investment in the US? And that's what we have started to see in some of the deals. Pharma is not calling it MFN deals. They're calling it tariff deals in which they are committing to investment and then they're committing to price parity. So why this becomes important is we're going to do future planning soon. We would be launching drugs in 2 years, 3 years, or industry would be. You have to almost predict the future. And to predict the future, you have to understand the basis of why different things are happening today. Is it to reduce drug prices or is it to get more investment in the US and manufacture?
Right. Well, that's very well explained. Thank you so much, Chris.
And if I could
Kiki.
just build on that for a second, I think it's
Sure.
super important when we say reducing prices, it's very important for us to understand who the prices are being reduced for. And with new policies under the IRA, for example, with the Medicare drug out-of-pocket maximum for a patient of $2,000, with the use of co-payments versus co-insurance. From what I understand and speaking with folks here at work and elsewhere, if a patient is paying a percent of a drug, co-insurance, then if the price of a drug is lower, then the amount that patient pays is lower because it's percent of drug. But if a patient is paying a copay and the government is able to negotiate the price down, that copay we do not expect to change. So the price is coming down for government in every deal that they make. Good for them. No, I'm not criticizing that at all. But I just also want to make sure when we hear the rhetoric that prices are coming down for all American or the elderly, all the elderly, Medicare, something like that. I have a saying that in life, all things are true. So there could be a ripple effect in which all of this does translate to lower overall cost, and then maybe premiums come down the road. Who knows? But the price of a medication that the patient pays for, if they're paying a copay, which is the vast majority, is not likely to go down. And there are unfortunately patients that go through that $2,000 out-of-pocket maximum very quickly because of the cost of the medication. And so it's a very nuanced lens as to, in terms of the patient and how much the price is coming down to the patient, how many that applies to.
And I think I totally understand both these perspectives because on the one hand, it's a legit ask. If, let's say, a brand of GLP-1 inhibitor sells for £1,000 in the US and is available for $45 in Croatia, then why does US need to pay so much for the same drug? And on the other hand, it's also a matter of equity, access. How do we make the innovation accessible to developing countries or low and middle income countries? So I think it's a legit dilemma that pharma companies are facing today between access, equity, parity, and also fairness. So I think it is going to be a great conversation. And what I've heard is there are companies that have negotiated agreements to avoid tariffs or price penalties. For instance, we've seen Pfizer, AstraZeneca, EMD, and these often get labeled as MFN, but they are not quite that, right? Chris, can you unpack the difference between true MFN and these MFN-like arrangements we've seen recently?
Sure thing. In fact, I've not read every headline of every newspaper about the Pfizer and AstraZeneca deals, and apparently there's an EMD Serono one in there too. I'm not too sure about. And if you read the coverage on it, they never apparently say MFN. Okay. again, and what I explained before is that the MFN formally in the executive order, as I understand it, was applicable to Medicare with some intention to then apply to Medicaid down the line. And the Pfizer and AstraZeneca deals that you just mentioned were for Medicaid patients. And
Hmm.
the language was around a most favored price in the globe, something around, but it wasn't specifically MFN. Same idea,
Right.
but again, specifically for Medicaid patients. Now, since the generous model has come, and what's interesting about that, it is also just for Medicaid. However, it seems to have some, there's no, I don't think there's any official language in it for this, but there is the discussion, will it then move into Medicare?
Hmm.
So if that's the case, then you asked Pratit earlier, with like, what's the ultimate purpose of MFN? And I really do think it is a negotiation tactic. In other words, we heard these really big headlines, really big news. I was at NASP and AMCP months ago, and every other session was about MFN and drug pricing. So it worked. It made everybody stop and think and make all these deals, or some deals, I should say, because if you shoot real high, then the theory is you'll get here. But if you shoot
Yeah.
mid, you'll come in down here, right? So it's this average of. So anyway, and the other
Right.
thing that was interesting about this generous pilot is it's now looking for the second most favored nation price. So what I'm really trying to say here, I think the purpose of the MFN and all of these sort of domino effect policies and discussions was to just disrupt.
Hmm.
And in that regard, it's worked. It's disrupting. Things are changing. I have no idea. Like nobody can really know like what the future really holds. So for example, was it a month ago, the Supreme Court heard arguments for and against the tariff. Well, what if they vote that the tariff that President Trump has put in place are no good? What happens to all of these programs?
Yeah. And every policy comes with a promise, and MFN's big promise is affordability. And there's a huge question that keeps coming up, even among senior leaders. Will this actually make medicines more affordable for patients? So, this is a question for both of you. What problem is MFN supposed to solve for policymakers? And does MFN meaningfully reduce patients' out of pocket cost, or is that a misconception?
Prateek, you're first on this one.
So I'm based out of London, so I'm going to talk about ex-US countries. So consultant by training, I always try to do problem solving. The problem solving nature starts with the key definition, which is market access. That means access the market. Market access works on identifying payer. Payer is the person who's paying for the medication or the drug. So in countries in Europe, because of the public healthcare system, the government is the payer. They negotiate the price. Majority of the population gets it free of cost. So would the governments increase their willingness to pay is a question and an economical question. So it's related to economy, it's related to budget deficits, how much government can spend on it. So that relates to access equity. Now, if I talk about low to middle income countries, they are right now not included in MFN or not considered in MFN. Does that mean they would not be included in next 2 years? I don't have an answer. Or would the basket of countries change? And to Kaushik, your first point, how to launch, where to launch, what's the value of the drug? And on top of that, consider health equity, global health equity. These are some dilemmas facing pharma industry today. Chris, over to you.
You know, in preparing for this podcast, because Kasha gave us a lot of tough questions to address, I wanted to get a better idea, again, of what I was mentioning before about what patients are actually going to pay, right? And it occurred to me how many patients under that Medicare Part D $2,000 out-of-pocket max cap are going to hit that. 16% of Medicare beneficiaries are likely to hit that $2,000 cap. That's 16% of 70 million people. So that's a big deal for the 16%. Okay.
Indeed.
And we can argue, which I won't, whether $2,000 is the right cap, if it's affordable for most or not most of Medicare beneficiaries. But But for those who aren't hitting the cap, every dollar that they spend more on their medications is something that they feel. Okay, so maybe more people will hit that cap maybe less people will hit that cap if prices are actually reduced. And the ones who hit it are the ones who have a lot of the high cost medications, so they'll blow through that. But no, proceed. I think otherwise, your analogy was spot.
Right. And something market access leader told me recently is that if MFN lands in the US, Europe becomes a risk, not a launch anchor. And that really stuck with me. Prateek, walk us through the global ripple effect. Which regions feel the impact first and why?
The first is the countries which have been mentioned in the executive order or different orders or programs. They feel the impact because prices in the US traditionally have been higher. Majority of these countries are within 60% of the GDP of the US, very a similar development, at least per capita basis. And they are publicly funded payer systems. That means government is paying for the medication. So the ability for the governments to pay more for existing drugs is rather limited. There might be frameworks which might get changed over time. And when I'm talking time, we're talking about months or years over here rather than days to pay a little bit more for drugs. But would it be 2 times more, 3 times more? It may be difficult. So
Chris.
So Prateek, I gotta ask. So I love that you brought that up because there's been some ideas on how much more these other countries are going to pay outside of US. And I asked before, well, why haven't they been paying that higher price already? So how does this force these other countries to pay more? Like, what do they care if US Americans are paying, whatever we're paying? And you just said, hey, look, if we're paying 5x more than this other country, and so this other country then doubles or triples its price, so it's still less than America. But what happens? And if all the drug companies have to do this, it's not like one drug company is going to get locked out, right? And they can't rebate that back down to what it was before because that's still net lowest price. So the other country has to pay more because they need at least one of the four drugs in the drug class, and they're all going up. So what happens?
So does the definition of innovation change? I think it might. And truly innovative drug which radically disrupts treatment might get valued a lot higher. If it's a third product in the MOA and very crowded indication, definitely the prices are not going to increase. So the definition of innovation would change. How companies are prioritizing development of drugs might have to change.
And look, I invest in the S&P 500 over here, which I'm sure has a few drug companies. I expect Pfizer, AstraZeneca, all of these big companies and mid-sized companies, they all have shareholders that demand that they still make money, that they still drive lots and lots of revenue. So it's not like they're going to throw up their arms and say, forget it, we're not making any more drum. They continue to have to find a way to generate a lot of revenue for everybody, and to deliver good medications for patients and support providers, the whole bit. So they have to survive. They have to succeed. Perhaps one scenario is in which, maybe there's less R&D, but maybe it's focused on R&D that there's a stronger prospect of therapeutic success. And maybe there are programs that are really just kind of far-fetched. Good that we do that because it discovers other things. When we say reduce R&D, I think it's important to peel back the onion and say, okay, what R&D might get reduced? And I don't know. So up to you, Doc.
So the way we think about it is, would it be the same across therapeutic areas? Maybe no. If you look at the price volume curve, there's going to be a sweet spot for every indication. And if you start doing scenario planning, looking at global launches, they would be at some place where the price and the volume, considering international price referencing, MFN, has a sweet spot. If you think about the global population versus the US population, they are much more populous countries. In which indications or therapeutic areas would we need to find more patients? Those are orphan diseases or oncology when you're looking for a very specific biomarker, where you have to increase the volume and you would be willing to take a little bit of price cut to maximize your commercial potential. So that's why how pharma has to plan for MFN has to be by product. It can be at the broad company level, but unless until you go by product, you would not find that sweet.
That's fair. For example, I visited with a client last week in New Jersey, and it occurred to me that about 80% of the portfolio was commercial payer business here in America, right? Very, very few Medicare, Medicaid patients for their therapy. So,
Chris, I had a question. Why would MFN not impact the commercial channel?
so here in the States, often what happens is if a deal, a rebate deal is made between a manufacturer and a drug company manufacturer for Medicare patients, that it will, and if the drug has indications for both Medicare age 65 and older, et cetera, as well as under 65, quote, commercial, the deals will carry over into commercial. Not by magic, they'll write separate deals, but the expectation is that it's going to go that way. And that's what popped up with the MFPs, the maximum fair pricing policies, which confuses everything even more. And then deals made for that would also carry over to commercial. And that seems to be the expectation, at least in oncology, that I researched last year, on both the payer and the manufacturers.
And like I mentioned in my early introduction, that I've actually heard leaders say that they might have to delay a European launch to protect the US price. And I've heard others say delaying Europe would damage access and relationships. So it's a real catch-22. So Prateek, how does MFN interfere with launch sequencing and evidence strategy?
The first thing is uncertainty. MFN still has to get implemented. How it actually shapes up within 2 years or 3 years of the current government is uncertain. If it's a tool, the tool can be adapted. And if I had to look in a crystal ball, it would keep on changing until the desired outcome comes. So what do you do as the first step to mitigate risk? You want uncertainty to reduce. What are you going to do to reduce the uncertainty is create multiple launch sequences. Do not get stuck to one launch sequence. You should have almost a flag post on what's going to happen. And if this happens, this is my launch sequence. If this happens, this is my launch sequence. And throughout, keep on doing the critical activities across the globe. You really do not want to be in a position where you're unprepared and the policy environment is favorable for your product or your launch in that country.
And Chris, how would those choices play out on the US side?
So again, because every company is driven by revenue, not saying that with any jaded, that's how the world works, not just revenue, but hear me out. If they're under pressure to generate revenue and they delay launches outside of the US and they have to make up for that lost revenue internationally, it's my crystal ball, it says the prices could go through the roof here for a couple of years until they launch overseas, at which point everything comes down. I don't know, right? And that in fact, I'm glad that you asked that question, because it highlights the fact that there is no way for me or anybody else to know, what's actually going to be the MFN or any other related drug pricing policy, how it's going to play out. And I do respect all the people who are way smarter than me and more knowledgeable about how the world works in these other countries and all of this. It's wonderful. And at the same time, it's unpredictable. But it is examinable. We can estimate spectrums of the future. In fact, Prateek and I ran a workshop internally doing just that, looking at different strategic scenarios and how the world could turn out in these different ways, and therefore what might we do. And I appreciate what you brought up before, Prateek, about the flagpole. Okay, and so if we had a series of flagpoles or signposts that we looked at every 3 months or so, or these days every other day with the newspaper, but more seriously, every 3 months to see how things are actually shaping up, then if we can sort of map out different paths of signposts ahead of time, then we won't be caught off guard as much later. We can say, okay, here are the different worlds that could happen. Looks like we're heading this way. So we should implement those plans. But before we talk more about that, Prateek, I was wondering, I keep reading, I mean, I know what value-based care is here in America, at least what it's supposed to, but apparently that might become, these value-based deals might become even more popular throughout the world and other countries under the MFN or whatever it is going to be called. Has Have you read much about that or thought about it?
In theory, MFN would be applied based on SKU, individual pack. So any discounting for future value would be difficult to account for. So when you're not considering the cost of treating a patient as your benchmark of comparing prices, but you are considering an individual packet or a bottle or a vial as a reference, the value-based contracting becomes difficult. Now, where it starts to impact is on the calculation of the net price. And that becomes even more complex with the value-based pricing because now you will have to discount and then report it to the US government on the net price basis. So more work for pharma, at least to understand the true net price of their product to report it.
So perfectly complicated.
Yes.
Okay.
A friend of a consultant, I may say.
And Kausha, if you don't mind, I have one more question for Prateek.
Please go
And
for
you,
it.
if you have any ideas about this, of course, drug classes get crowded over time. The first one that comes out in a new class, there's a lot of research around it, a lot of development, a lot of money put into it. And let's just argue that the same is true for the second and maybe the third. Okay. But you get into the fourth and fifth. And I have to imagine, yes, it's not cheap to bring a drug to market in any state, but if it's the fourth or fifth, the costs are lower. Theoretically, and I'm going to show some naivete here, theoretically, that fourth or fifth in that class could get priced a lot lower. And so is this MFN setting up for this dynamic where we do introduce many products in, because how many do you need in a class? How different are they really? Okay. So if you introduce it in the fourth and fifth and it can be much lower, are we just waiting for that fourth and fifth one to come along to then set the lowest price for that drug in the world? But as I'm saying that, I'm realizing that the government isn't looking for the lowest favored product in the nation, right? The fourth or fifth, they're looking for the lowest price of each individual drug across the world. So it kind of gets, it overlaps in complexity that way.
So I'm going to simplify value assessment frameworks for pharma ex-US a lot in my discussion. So if you're launching a second product, how much better would that product be? 10%? That's the value. That's how much the price would be, and more if possible. Third product versus the second product, maybe it becomes 7. Fourth product, it becomes 5%. So it almost, the increment starts to decrease. Now the question which comes is why would companies even invest in developing the fourth or the fifth product when there's limited price premium? The volume is anyways going to be divided. So would you start to focus again more on innovative medicines with a new definition of innovation?
Fair.
Because in the end, what's happening is money is getting reduced in theory. If price decreases, money would get reduced. And the reason why it might be price decreases because of the ability of the OUS countries to pay more and how much more. An example I would give is the very recent US UK deal. The upper bound of the threshold of a methodology called ICER was 30K earlier. Now it's become 30K pounds per quality. That's a 10% or less than 20% increase. If the methodology remains the same, new products can get priced in UK 20% more, but that doesn't account for 3x more price in US.
So Prateek, on the flip side, I was listening to a podcast by an advocacy group here in the US, and they were concerned that the US was going to take on the value per quality that is used outside of the US. So for example, as I understand it, you use pounds, I use dollars. It's $50,000 per quality outside of the US. It's $150,000 per quality here in the US. So will then, not expect you to answer this, but us trying to align with the rest of the world, bring that down? And if so, what does that mean? I'm not asking you to.
Sure. So that's almost linked to US prices being 3x more. If the prices get normalized, the cost per quality would get normalized across the world.
Interesting. I was reading more about the generous model that we're talking about for Medicaid, and something popped out of that in it, there is this incentive for the state to adopt unified coverage criteria. Okay, so they only get access to the rebates if they agree to this unified coverage criteria. And what that meant to me was essentially a PBM's national template formula. So if they have a health plan client, when the health plan client agrees to the PBM's national formulary, then they get access to all these rebates. But if the health plan wants to do its own, then those rebates start becoming in question. It's like, oh, so the government is now a big PBM. And Copilot AI agreed with me, just so you know.
Like you could say government is then PBM in Europe, in UK. They're buying all the drugs, supplying all the drugs, negotiating the price. Yeah.
One of the surprising insights for people outside the access world is how differently countries define value and how that becomes a problem if prices start cross referencing each other. So, Prateet, how would MFN interact with global value assessment frameworks, and why do PICO and comparator choice becomes so complicated? And for those of you, I didn't know what PICO stood for. So PICO is P stands for population patient problem, I for intervention, C for comparison, and O for outcome.
Price referencing globally is a very old concept, and many countries use it. It's a new concept in the US. It really never worked very effectively because nobody knew the actual price which other country was paying. So there were a lot of frameworks, and those frameworks would still exist. But now the actual price which countries are paying might come out. And then each and every country might start asking the question, why am I paying more? Like that's like coming back to my 12-year-old analogy why would I pay more for the burger? So if everybody knows what they're paying for the burger and the burger is the same, you'll go to the shop where it's the cheapest.
Makes sense. And let's unpack what happens to confidential discounts if MFN arrives. And confidential discounts are the backbone of how pharma manages access, I guess. I've heard some people say MFN could completely break that model. So, Chris, does MFN risk exposing or destabilizing confidential contracting?
Theoretically, it will. If a industry exposes all of its prices, and the negotiations are based on confidentiality of price, then as Prateek was mentioning, you get the well, how about me also effect, or all these other groups saying, how come I don't have the same pricing? And you could respond on one hand saying, well, customer A, let's call it Japan, is buying the drug for nearly all of its citizens. I think it's, God, I did it the other day. Is it around 150 million people, or am I way off? Anyway, and so one country with more people could probably strike a better deal, lower price, than another country with less people, just because of volume. So that would seem relatively fair, I guess. But I also wonder if the confidentiality essentially makes average price of the globe, confidential average price, lower. And if you expose it all, then potentially on average, the price could rise across the globe, because then you don't have like some leverage in that. You know, I was interviewing, as an analogy, I was interviewing a health plan many months ago, and the idea of rebates in oncology came up, and with PBM reform here in the States, with the potential of making all the rebate deals transparent. And we keep focusing on the PBM with that notion, but the health plan person said that would be bad for us, because one of the ways in which we compete as a health plan against other health plans to get an employer's business is to say that we can negotiate rebates better than the next guy. But if all the rebates are on the table, it becomes a flat field. And now that ability to compete on that for the employer business goes away. So there's always these layers of the onion that have to be peeled back. So yeah, I think the simple answer is yes, that rebating across the board then becomes at risk for good, bad, and indifferent.
Right. And Prateet, how would that ripple into Europe and other HTA markets?
I was thinking about something, Kaushik.
Mhm.
If my phone cost can be the same irrespective of the geography, why can a drug price which is going to slice not be the same? Both are by private manufacturers, their companies. Everybody is making profits accountable to the shareholders. Over a period of time, as even the technology evolves, information is going to be more and more in the public domain. As more information comes in the public domain, the prices, confidential net prices, would start to become more visible. In fact, in countries like Spain, Italy, before MFN, there was a big push to make the net prices visible at the national levels. How it evolves now, difficult to predict.
I think with my limited knowledge and understanding of MFN, if I were to predict the future, maybe a few years down the line, the entire world might come up with a yardstick to categorize and classify different countries on the basis of affordability. So you might see 7 different levels of 7 different countries, and there are some calculations that apply for each of those categories of markets. And I think that would be way simplified, because you raised a very good point that if iPhone can be standardized everywhere all across the markets, why can't drugs be? Because maybe I think one of the reasons is that these are life-saving medicines, and that's why the people who may have low purchasing power should have equal access to the life-saving medicines. But I think we are reaching a point of maturity where all the markets can be categorized and classified into different levels based on their affordability. And then what's your take on that? Do you think that's the likely scenario in future?
I think MFN also catered to it a little bit.
Mm,
You looked at GDP per capita, which could be a surrogate for affordability.
right.
Is it perfect? No. Should the drug pricing in an ideal world just be linked to affordability and the need? And whatever the percentage of GDP per capita is across the globe, everybody should pay that. That's an idealistic world.
One
But
thing that I think that we're not addressing here so far, and you helped me understand this a couple weeks ago better, in that outside of the US, there are what I'll call no middlemen. There's a reason why I have a job. It's because the healthcare system here is so incredibly complex, and there's so many people making money off of drugs. Rest of the world, it's not like that. So the U. I know I said we wouldn't get into the why things are so expensive here in the U.S., but I'm one of the reasons why, because I'm a consultant that makes money off of, the industry in a way. I don't mean to be so jaded about that, but that is a big deal. If you call the PBM an intermediary, a GPO is technically an intermediary. And I think I'm open to being corrected on this by anybody, but it seems to me that there are only two groups that would want drug price lower here in the US, the government and the patient.
yeah,
Okay. Buy and bill, doctors make money. And the higher the price, the bigger the rebate, the more money for them. Arguably the same thing for a health plan. And again, I know I could be corrected on that. I'm being too general. But there's a lot of incentive for a lot of people here in America for drug prices to be high. So okay, if we go along with that, let's just say that's true. Then yes, of course, the government wants to bring down price for at least Medicaid here. But no, let the rest of the world now pay more to support the need for all these intermediaries that are making the price higher here in America. Anyway, that might need to be a glass of wine at the next conference, so I'll leave that one alone. But there you go. In fact, one other concept, because you were talking about this sort of, I don't know this very well, but apparently some of the big box stores like the Targets and the Walmarts, et cetera, are playing with some kind of program that I don't know how it works, but they will charge different amounts for the same bottle of soda, depending on who you are as the consumer, the individual person. Okay. Again, I don't know how it
Wow.
works. There's a term for it. It's becoming an idea. And so you would think that if somebody was making $200,000 a year salary, would pay a little bit more for the soda than somebody who pays a lot less. Now, I would just say get rid of the soda, but let's say it's a bottle of water. But apparently, and again, I'm speaking way outside of my bounds right now, apparently it might actually flip because the person who's making more might not have the time to worry about it or something. I don't know. I'm getting it all wrong. But look, there are models out there that will look at all of this, including drugs, I assume, at some point.
But I think that's a valid point. If you've seen something like that, it's really shocking, and I'd be keen to see how that mechanism works. Now we get to the most interesting and my favorite parts of the conversation, the moment where theory becomes real. So what's one scenario that sounds unlikely or extreme, but is absolutely plausible if MFN takes hold? Chris, you take US first, and then Prateek, the global version.
So, because my crystal ball broke last week, I have to go on my own artificial intelligence here. And I would say that on one hand, especially with what the courts come back with about the tariffs, I don't know when they're coming back with that decision. I do not think there's a world without impact of some sort of MFN model. I get the feeling that the generous program could take hold pretty easily. And so at the low end of the spectrum, the MFN and other drug pricing policies are caught up in the courts. Even so, you see again, like you mentioned, Pfizer and AstraZeneca already making deals. Deals will happen in certain areas. But if you also sort of like layer in the economy, why do we have the MFN? It's not just because the country is paying more than the rest of the world. It's also because the economy has been, I mean, now I think it's pretty decent, was theoretically shaky. So now you have to come up with these programs. If the economy was booming this whole time, I'm not sure the MFN would have been such a big splash. I don't know, because maybe it wasn't as needed as much. So so it could be MFN-like, if you will. So some deals happening, maybe it's mostly Medicaid, a little bit of Medicare. Let's say orphan and protected drug classes are not included. So it's just like these big retail brands. But on the flip side, we could absolutely see a world in which the MFN and other drug pricing policies have really taken shape, especially as elections come back in a few years. If that's a really key message, if people can actually feel a lower price, I'm not sure how that would happen, but if they can feel it, or at least believe that that's true because they're told that. In other words, I think there is plenty of politicians and Americans, I think, that are generally in favor of the concept of MFN if they think they're going to be paying less and because they think the price that America pays is more fair. So with that, I don't know that there would be a lot of political hurdles to really push those agendas forward. So for that reason, if somebody offered me a dollar bet, I would bet on a pretty robust pricing policy future that is different than today, much more active, and I dare say cheaper, but yeah, the pervasive.
Prateek, would you like to?
So if you just look at the economy, US economy is around 30 trillion. German economy is around 4-5 trillion. There's a serious question about affordability. Can you afford those higher prices in outside US countries? If I look at my crystal ball, which has not broken, I really don't think 3 times or 5 times higher prices can be afforded by majority of the. Now, if countries, I'm not saying individuals, if countries are not able to afford higher price, how long would they not get access to that? There would be a pivot point, there would be a breaking point somewhere.
So, Pratik, you're saying that if the price was increased that much and the government says, look, we just can't do it. And the pharmaceutical company
Yeah,
then saying, well, we can't go any lower because we'd have to then offer that to the US. And so,
yeah,
sorry, we just can't give you our product then. Is that?
yeah. So for how long would this game play out? Until 5 years, until products go off patent? These are big questions.
And Pratik, I think your white paper addresses this a little bit that you wrote a couple months back. And that the
Yeah,
natural question for me is then, well, how important is the US market versus the ex-US market? 90% of a particular drug sales are US anyway. And I as you keep talking, I realize how US centric I am, and it's almost embarrassing. And I apologize to the world for that. Um, on the flip side, if let's say 50% of a drug's revenue is outside the US, now that's a problem for manufacturers. So where does
yeah.
that split tend to be? Like how important is the ex-US market for these drug companies?
If you need patient volume, and if it's a smaller indication, you need to target broader populations globally. That means ex-US markets become more important. So often drugs, oncology treatments, ex-US markets become more important. But again, coming back, where's that price volume sweet point may be very different from the product to product, indication by indication.
Right. So coming back to the last question from our today's conversation, let's say if you had 30 seconds with a CEO Or let me make it 3 minutes. If you had 3 minutes with a CEO, what's one action they should take now to future-proof their launches against MFN? And
Scenario plan. I think we covered it all, Kaushik,
yeah,
today. It's
you've covered it.
basically signpost, identify the scenarios, and start planning for different worlds.
So that can be an audacious process. In other words, we've all done scenario planning. And there's sort of there's different versions of it. One version is near term, 1-2 years, and you write out a scenario and you say, well, what if this part changed? And you write out another scenario. And then this part changed. So 3-4 scenarios with like almost conjoint analysis. But we're trying to figure out what the world's going to be like in 3-5 years. Still act now, but act now based on an idea of what the world could be like, I should say, again, 3-5+ years out. And that's why I like the one that we did a few weeks ago, that strategic scenario planning method that we ended up calling the risk mitigation method, because it allows organizations to think about their own portfolio, their own needs, their own risks, if you will, within this spectrum of uncertainty in a methodical way, so that they can explore these the 2x2 matrix, for example, those 4 scenarios that are really ends of the spectrum, but plausible, realistic spectrum. Take a look at how each of the key stakeholders in their business can be impacted in each one of those worlds. And then from that, understand what the individual client that we'll be working with, what they have to do in that future world to succeed, and even define what success is. It could just be survival in some scenarios. In other scenarios, it could actually create a great market opportunity for them. And then sort of backcast it today, saying, well, if we thought it was going to be this scenario B, for example, what will we start doing now? And looking at that across the scenarios and saying, okay, in 3 to 4 scenarios, we would start doing X, setting up negotiation plans or something. And so, okay, that looks like something we should probably start doing now, while we monitor the industry and the market as we go through, monitoring those signposts regularly with benchmark dashboard data. And what I have found anyway is that this process not only allows us to have that more global awareness, if you will, awareness across all possibilities. And in the meantime, it has helped my teams align on what the real uncertainties are. Because we don't just look at the MFN. We'll look at drug pricing more broadly. We'll look at other major uncertainties and help the whole team really understand which ones are really important, perhaps not that uncertain actually, and certain elements of the MFN are probably not that unpredictable. Certain ones are. And it just helps the whole team align on a common understanding, a common path, and become a center of excellence within their own organization. That's what I've seen in the past.
Right. Thank you so much. That was a really very insightful answer, Chris. And that brings us to the end of today's conversation. And if there's one thing today that has become clear, it's that MFN isn't a policy to monitor. It's a shift you need to prepare for right now. The implications for pricing, access, evidence, and global launch sequencing are too big, too interconnected, and moving too quickly to ignore. So, Prateek, thank you for breaking down the global and HTA perspective with such clarity. And Chris, thank you for helping us understand the US policy reality behind MFN. You've both turned something complex into something leaders can act on immediately. And to everyone listening, if this conversation sparked questions, worries, or even the gut feel of we are not ready, don't wait. Syneos Health is offering a risk mitigation method introduction meeting, but only for the first 10 people who reach out. So if you want to understand your exposure and build a future-proof plan, comment below or DM me directly to secure one of those spots. This is first come, first serve. So once the 10 sessions are gone, they're gone. I'm Kaushik Trivedi. This is Drug Diaries, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, Chris and Prateek, for joining us today.
Thank you.